So we're finally on to the first set of class cards. We're going to start with Druid and then go alphabetically down to Warrior. First up we have the Druid Legendary, Kun the Forgotten King. So I thought this card was pretty cool when they first showed it, but the more I look at it, the more I think it's just kind of an okay card. Of course the big draw for this card is that it's a 0 mana 7/7, but you can't do that until turn 10. And generally it's not a good idea to have 10 mana cards rotting in your hand until the late game if they don't actually win you the game when you play them. And I don't think Kun the Forgotten King is going to win you the game very often. There are some pretty ridiculous things you can do with Aviana, Kun the Forgotten King, and flood your board. Against a lot of classes you probably win when you do that, but Warrior has Brawl, Paladin has Equality Consecration, Shaman has Spell Damage, Lightning Storms. So even if you just flood the board with a ton of huge minions, it's not even necessarily going to be that difficult for the opponent to deal with it. You can also just play this as like a tempo play on turn 10. You play, I don't know, like your Ancient of War and you Wrath something, but you can also throw down Kun the Forgotten King with that. But Druid kind of already has access to plays like that, since they use Arcane Giant so well. But Arcane Giant can be played pretty cheaply before turn 10. Whereas Kun the Forgotten King is going to be rotting in your hand until you're at 10 mana. And as a Druid, it's not that hard to get to 10 mana. But it might be a little bit hard to get to 10 mana if you have Kun the Forgotten King rotting in your hand, so I don't know, I find this card a little bit underwhelming, and not necessarily too much more impressive than what Druid can already do on 10 mana. It also has the option to gain you 10 armor, and 10 armor is not a trivial amount of armor. When you consider that you only start with 30 health, 10 armor is 33% of your health on top of that. Which if you get to 10 mana and you can play this guy against aggro and gain 10 armor, you're probably going to win that game, so having that flexibility probably makes this better than Arcane Giant. And if you're playing a non-spell based Druid deck, this card is obviously better than Arcane Giant. I think this card is strong. I think it will probably see some amount of play, but I don't think it's going to be nuts, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it saw 0 play. I'll try it out in Astral Druid though. This card's dope in Astral Druid. Next up we have Mark of the Lotus. Not really sure why this card exists. A lot of Druid decks already play this card for 2 mana, so now they can play it for 1. You give up the flexibility of the 3/2 Panther, but you play Power of the Wild for the +1/+1 like 90% of the time in Toka Druid anyway. So since you can play this for 1 mana instead of 2, this makes your Violet Teacher combos come out a turn earlier. That makes them just that much more difficult to deal with. You can steal games even earlier on. So I think Token Druid absolutely plays this card. I think the only question is Token Druid viable? And now that it can play up to 4 of this effect, 2 of them being for 1 mana, I think Token Druid is definitely a contender. So there's not much to say about this card. It's basically a card that already exists and sees play, but it's half the mana, so I expect it to see some amount of play. Pilfered Power is a really weird card. You gain an empty mana crystal for each friendly minion. The thing about ramp is that there's like a very specific set of turns where ramping is actually good. And that's generally going to be like before turn 5, I would say ramping is pretty good. But to make this card better than Wild Growth, you need multiple minions on the board. And to have multiple minions on the board on turn 3 or even turn 4 for this card, you probably have to be playing a fairly aggressive list. And if you're playing a fairly aggressive list with a low enough curve that you can have multiple minions on the board to activate Pilfered Power, then you probably don't really care about the ramp too much. You'd rather just be killing the opponent with like Savage Roar or something like that. So it just seems like this card is a bit awkward. I don't really know what deck wants to play it and can support it, so I don't think it'll see too much play. But it is a ramp card. Ramp is extremely strong. And if this card is playable, it's probably broken. But I don't think it's playable. Lunar Visions seems to be a card for a deck that doesn't really exist right now. In any of the spell-based decks, you would much rather just play Nourish, 5 mana draw 3 instead of 5 mana draw 2. The benefit of Lunar Visions, of course, is if you hit minions, you get a mana discount on them. If you get 1 mana discount off this card, or if you hit 1 minion with it, I should say, then you can compare it to Arcane Intellect. It's still worse than Arcane Intellect, because even though you pay 3 mana kind of, you can't play it until turn 5, or your upfront investment into this card is 5 mana, but it's still pretty comparable. If you're playing, I don't know, something like Beast Druid, that just has like a lot of minions in it, then I think Lunar Visions could be a pretty good card. The thing is that most Druid decks that play a lot of minions are pretty aggressive, and generally want to be developing a pretty big board on turn 5 or even killing the opponent on turn 5. So I'm not sure that they would really want Lunar Visions. In those kinds of decks, if you want card draw, you're probably better off playing Azure Drake, especially since Beast Druid can play Azure Drake with Curator. But Lunar Visions is theoretically pretty good in a minion-based Druid deck. I don't think there's any current Druid deck that would play this card, but I can easily envision a Druid deck that would play this card, so I think it's a nice card. On to Hunter cards, we have a weapon, Piranha Launcher. I don't think this card is like super strong, but I do think it's a little bit underrated by the community. If you assume that you're getting your full value out of this card, it's 8 face damage with just the weapon durability. And you also get to summon 1/1 Piranhas, which theoretically also do damage or demand removal from the opponent. The Piranhas are also beasts, so if you're top decking and have this in play, then cards like Kill Command are always going to be active if you draw into them with a Piranha Launcher on the board. Or even if you can manage to play this in like a mid-rangey list, a card like Houndmaster is always going to be active. So if you get the full value, this card does offer a lot of face damage, it offers a lot of board presence, and it activates a lot of your synergy cards. But the problem is it's pretty slow. If you play this on turn 5, you're not getting full value until turn 8. And then even if you consider that you get all your face damage by turn 8, you can't use Eaglehorn Bow while this card is equipped. You also have to just like give up playing a Stranglethorn Tiger or something like that on turn 5. Maybe even just like Animal Companion plus Hero Power would be a better play on 5 mana than this card. But theoretically, if you can get full value out of this card, it does a lot of damage. I'm going to probably try out an aggressive Hunter list with this card at the top end, but I don't think it'll be too successful, but I don't think it'll be completely awful. I don't think this card is like Tentacles for Arms level of bad. I think it's more playable than something like this. So we're done with Hunter already, on to Mage. Manic Soulcaster is a weird card. So you're shuffling a card into your deck, which means that this card is potentially good in a deck where you're worried about fatigue. So you'd have to be playing a pretty heavy control deck, I'd say. Probably like Reno Mage would be a good place to find a home for this card. In the case of Reno Mage, you could even shuffle a copy of Reno Jackson into your deck if you happen to land this at the right time. But this card is very slow. So if you're using its effect and expecting to get value out of it, you need to be in a pretty heavy control matchup, probably one that's going to be getting close to, if not actually reaching fatigue. And if you reach fatigue, you get a second copy of an important card like Reno, plus you have 1 extra card in your deck so you delay your fatigue for an extra turn. But in aggressive matchups, the text on this card is never going to be relevant, or it's very unlikely to be relevant. But you can just play this card as a spider tank in those matchups, and I think that's kind of okay for a control deck. A card that is situationally very powerful, but in the worst case scenario, still passes the vanilla test for stats. But even in a control deck, this card is pretty slow, but I think it does have potential in the right metagame. I certainly think this is a card you consider playing in something like Reno Mage. This is definitely not a Tempo Mage card. In Tempo Mage, you're never getting value out of the Battle Cry on this card, and if you just play it on curve, you're pretty likely to have like a Mana Worm on the board. And if you happen to draw that Mana Worm later in the game, the Mana Worm is probably going to be a worse draw than what you would have drawn otherwise. So the Battle Cry on this card for an aggressive Mage deck is actually kind of a drawback, because you're drawing into a Mana Worm later on instead of drawing into, a Fireball or something that can finish off your opponent. So in Tempo Mage, it's a Spider Tank with negative text, and Tempo Mage wouldn't play Spider Tank, so definitely not a Tempo Mage card, but I think a strong consideration for a more control-oriented Mage deck. On to Paladin cards, we start with Meanstreet Marshal. So as just a 1 mana 1/2, this card is not very strong, but if you assume that you'll get the death rattle out of this card when you play it, it's pretty good. If you compare it to something like Runic Egg, it's basically just Runic Egg, except it actually has stats and you can use it to attack to kill itself off or just to deal face damage or whatever. And in Paladin, I think it is pretty reasonable to assume that you can consistently get the death rattle out of this card. Paladin has access to a lot of pretty strong on-board buffs, things like Blessing of Might, Divine Strength, even heavier cards like Blessing of Kings. And we've seen from this expansion that Grimy Goons cards are obviously kind of the reason that this card was printed. So Paladin has good on-board buffs, they make use of the Grimy Goons mechanic to buff this card in your hand, so when you play it, it'll already have 2 attack. It is a little bit vulnerable when you just play it on turn 1 though. If you just play it as a 1 mana 1/2, sometimes it will just get eaten up for free. but it's a 1-drop that you can play on turn 1, you don't feel bad about it, and it has a lot of value in the late game. So I think an aggressive Paladin deck that has a lot of buff cards, especially a Grimy Goons deck, would definitely consider playing this card. I think it's a strong card, and I think the design on this card is pretty cool. Next up is Small Time Recruits. So we saw that Paladin just got a new 1-drop, they already have access to some pretty strong 1-drops. Things like Selfless Hero, or even just neutral cards like Argent Squire or Abusive Sergeant or whatever. So there are a lot of pretty good draws off this card. If you look at this as just 3 mana draw 3, it's better than Arcane Intellect, which is 3 mana draw 2, but drawing 1-cost minions is probably worse than just drawing random cards from your deck, because random cards from your deck can be like board control spells or face damage or whatever. This card is just drawing 1-drops, which is less valuable. But like I said, 1-drops for Paladin are pretty strong, and if the Grimy Goons things takes off, having a bunch of 1-drops in your hand that you can all buff, and then play on the board the next turn or even that turn, that also seems like it could be a pretty strong mid-game play. So even though this card doesn't directly draw you into late game and mid-game cards, it does thin your deck by pulling out all the garbage 1-drops. So your natural draws, you're just that much more likely to draw a card like Tyrion, even though this card itself can't draw you into Tyrion. So I think there's a lot of value in that, in an aggressive deck that has a lot of cards that they want early game but don't necessarily want in the late game. One problem with this card is that it does compete with Divine Favor. The ceiling on Divine Favor is much higher than this card, but sometimes Divine Favor is completely useless. It's hard to say which is better, I think it kind of depends on the deck. And I don't think you're going to play 2 Divine Favor, 2 Small Time Recruits. So I think testing needs to be done to determine which one of these cards is better. But I think in a vacuum, Small Time Recruits is pretty strong. But maybe it just gets edged out by Divine Favor, kind of depends on the deck. But I think the card is strong, and aggressive Paladin decks that play, I don't know, like 6 1-drops or something would probably be very happy to have a card like this. Getaway Kodo is an interesting secret. So if we go back to Wild, we can kind of compare this card to the Mage Secret Duplicate. It's basically half a duplicate, but you pay 1/3 of the mana, which seems like a pretty good deal. You also want to compare this card to a Paladin secret that already exists, Redemption. So Redemption puts the minion back on the board, but it only has 1 health. Getaway Kodo gives it back to you in your hand. So Redemption is better with cards that have like Death Rattles. It's especially good on a card like Tyrion, which obviously Paladin decks play. But Getaway Kodo is better with Battle Cries, or basically even just non-Death Rattle minions. Even just something like Ragnaros Lightlord. Like if this dies, it doesn't really matter that it comes back as an 8/1. Your opponent's probably just going to kill it again anyway. So Getaway Kodo is pretty strong with a card like that. And it's not like it's bad on something like Tyrion. So there's a lot of potential value in this card. I've also heard some people say that you just go like turn 6, slam Leroy Jenkins and Getaway Kodo, hit him for 6, and then what are they going to do? Not kill your Leroy? Then you just get to hit him for 6 again. If they do kill it, you just play Leroy again next turn. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do with this card. I'm not really sure where this sees play. I don't think you play this in the aggressive Paladin deck that they seem to be pushing with the previous 2 cards. But I could see this kind of being like the resurrection of Secret Paladin. Obviously, if you play Mysterious Challenger and you just have like all the decent secrets in your deck, then Getaway Kodo is probably just going to pull a Noble Sacrifice back to your hand. But if you do that, you're still pulling the Getaway Kodo out of your deck to increase the chance of drawing better cards later on, which is kind of a lot of the hidden strength of Mysterious Challenger. It gets garbage out of your deck. Or maybe you can even just like cut Noble Sacrifice from that deck, that way Getaway Kodo is pretty likely to resurrect your Mysterious Challenger. Or maybe you even just still play the Noble Sacrifices and accept that Getaway Kodo isn't going to be the best, most impactful secret off of the Mysterious Challenger, but it's probably the best secret to draw without the Mysterious Challenger. And even if you do pull this and Noble Sacrifice at the same time, then this card is still pretty good against something like Fireball, because obviously Fireball isn't going to proc the Noble Sacrifice. So I think there's a lot of potential value in this card. I'm not really sure where it fits, I'm not sure if it's strong enough to revive Secret Paladin, but it's definitely an interesting card that I would not be at all surprised to see in competitive decks. So we've got the Paladin Legendary Wickerflame Burnbristle. I'm not really hyped on this card, a lot of people seem to be, but it just kind of seems like an okay 3-drop to me. The Divine Shield easily just gets like pinged off by even like Maelstrom Portal or Mage Hero Power, or even just like a Searing Totem. And then the 2/2 doesn't really contest anything. Like if you play this against Shaman, they just bump their Spirit Claws into the Divine Shield and then they Totem Golem your 2/2. And it's like, cool, you gain 2 health, but they have a 3/2 into weapon in play and you have nothing. I definitely see applications for this card, like it's pretty good against a double Flame Imp board from Zoo or something like that. But against Zoo, it still gets like pinged off by Knife Jugglers. I just think the stats on this card are just so low for turn 3. Of course, even if they can kill it somewhat efficiently, it does heal you for a bit, which is good against aggro. As a Paladin, you can like slam a big buff on this card and then heal for a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if this card saw play, but it's not going to be anywhere close to Tyrion, where when you're building a Paladin deck, you start with Tyrion and then figure out what other 29 cards you want. Wickerflame Burnbristle is like you find a 29 card deck and then you need a 30th, so maybe you put this guy in. I don't think he's unplayable, but I think he is like super underwhelming. And if he saw no play, I wouldn't be surprised at all. So we're finally on to the the Priest cards. And we all knew this was coming, right? Priest sucked, so they just get a bunch of OP cards. A year ago, Shaman was bad, so they got a bunch of OP cards, and now look where we are. 2 years ago, Paladin was awful, so they got a bunch of OP cards, and then Secret Paladin ruined the game for half a year. So now we're on to Priest. Let's see what Priest cards are going to ruin the game for the next year. First up, we'll start with probably the weakest one, Pint-Size Potion. So this card is pretty similar to Shrinkmeister, which was in GVG. You decrease the attack of an enemy minion, you can get good trades. Or in Priest specifically, you can combo it with cards like Kabal Talonpriest. Or even just like Shadow Word Pain is still pretty acceptable. With Pint-Size Potion specifically, you can combo it with Shadow Word Horror for a pretty good board clear. But Priest has a lot of board clears, and they have Auchenai Circle if they want a situational 2-card board clear. So I'm not sure that's really that strong. But these cards are both okay on their own. If the Shaman meta still exists, maybe Shadow Word Horror is just kind of an okay card anyway, and then Pint-Size Potion can kind of push it into viability. I think this card is cool. It can offer you a lot of good trades. There are a lot of Priest-specific combos that this card really helps enable. But Priest is getting a lot of good cards, so it's possible that you just have 30 better cards you can put in your Priest deck. And this card is pretty situational. Priest doesn't necessarily need more situational cards. Wouldn't be surprised if the card saw play, also wouldn't be surprised if it just got edged out by better cards. Potion of Madness is pretty insane. It's pretty comparable to Shadow Madness, but it costs 1/4 of the mana. The 3 power versus 2 power is a pretty significant difference, but if you're playing against Zoo and they have like a Flame Imp Knife Juggler board, and then you can kill both of those minions for 1 mana with Potion of Madness, that is pretty sick. It's also really good against cards like Loot Hoarder, or against Hunter specifically. It's very good against Kindly Grandmother. Kindly Grandmother is probably going to be one of the best targets for this card. This card is obviously very strong in a vacuum, but it's definitely going to be a very metagame dependent card. If there are a lot of good targets for it, you just auto-include 2 of these in your Priest deck. If there aren't that many good targets for it, you just don't play this card, obviously. So, metagame dependent card, probably will see some play at some point in time. Kabal Talonpriest, there's not really much to say about this card. You can kind of compare it to Dark Cultist. They do the same thing, except one's a Battle Cry, one's a Death Rattle. A lot of people have made comments that one is better than the other. For Priest, I kind of lean toward Dark Cultist being the better card, because Priest notoriously doesn't have good 2-drops. So it makes it hard to play Kabal Talonpriest on curve and actually get the Battle Cry out of the card, whereas Dark Cultist you can play it on 3, and then if they don't deal with it you can play your 4-drop and then trade it off. But the Kabal Talonpriest after turn 3 is going to have a much easier to confirm effect, so it's a little bit hard to say which one is stronger, but they're both strong cards, so it doesn't really matter. And even if you don't land the Battle Cry on this card, it's still Spider Tank, and if you do land the Battle Cry on this card, sometimes it's just going to be game winning. There's really just not much to say about this card. It's very strong. It's possible that just every Priest deck plays 2 copies of this card. Dragon Priest might even replace their Blackwing Technicians with this card. Giving up 1 health on this card for 3 health on your Twilight Whelp, or Wormrest Agent, or whatever you happen to have on board, or even in the mid-game, just land this on, your Azure Drake, or your Drakonid Operative, or whatever. This card is sick. It's gonna see play. The only way this card doesn't see play is if Priest is somehow still terrible. Drakonid Operative, I just referenced this card in the Kabal Talonpriest review. There's really not much to say about this card either. It's just a really good card. 5 mana, 5/6, draw a card. But the draw on this effect is arguably better than just drawing a card. You get to discover from your opponent's deck, which is stronger than standard discover, because when you normally discover, you're sometimes presented with garbage, and if your opponent chose to put cards in their deck, then presumably it's not a garbage card. It also gives you information about your opponent's deck if you're playing a paladin, and you have the choice to discover their Tyrion. Not only do you get to have a Tyrion, but you also have information that Tyrion is not in their hand, so you don't have to play around it. And it's still just a 5 mana 5/6, and it's a dragon. So you just auto-include 2 copies of this in your Dragon Priest deck, and this card might even be strong enough to make Dragon Priest a thing. So yeah, very strong card. I don't really like seeing cards like this, where there's like really no question how good the card is. It's just like, it has very solid vanilla stats, it has a beneficial dragon tag, and you get to draw a card out of it, so it's just like, yeah, this card, if you're building Dragon Priest, you put this card in your deck. Dragonfire Potion, another OP Dragon Priest card. 5 damage is a lot, and if you're playing dragons, obviously it's just better than Flame Strike. And Flame Strike is, you know, pretty strong card. This card costs 1 less and deals 1 more damage. So yeah, you just play this card in Dragon Priest, right? I guess you don't play this card in Dragon Priest if Dragon Priest is so good that every other matchup is Dragon Priest, because if your opponent's playing dragons, this card isn't very strong. So if you're ever queuing into decks that have non-dragons in them, you play this card in your Dragon Priest. But you probably also just play this card in every other Priest deck. If you're playing any other Priest deck, you probably don't have a board anyway, so it doesn't matter that this 5 damage hits both sides of the board, you just remove the opponent's board. And yeah, again, this is another Priest card that there's really not too much to evaluate. It just kills everything, so you put it in your Priest deck. The only Priest deck that is concerned about symmetrical AoE conveniently is not affected by this card, so you play this card in Priest. So now we're on to Rogue cards. First up is Counterfeit Coin. Let me start by saying that I am not a Miracle Rogue player by any means, and Miracle Rogue is really a deck that if you don't have experience with, you really just shouldn't be evaluating it, but I'm going to evaluate Counterfeit Coin anyway. Rogue makes really good use of the coin. Mostly they want to combine it with Gadgetzan Auctioneer to get a free mana to continue cycling, and also just go ahead and cycle the coin for an extra card. Rogue also just has natural synergies with the coin, things like Edwin Van Cleef, or SI7 Agent. I think Rogue is like the only class whose win rate goes up when they go second. They just make that good of use of the coin. They play Tomb Pillager in their deck because the coin is so good. Tomb Pillager is actually one of Rogue's strongest cards. But the thing about Tomb Pillager, and the thing about just naturally going second, is you don't give up a card slot to play your coin. If you're putting Counterfeit Coin in your deck, that means you have to take out another card. And that means when you draw Counterfeit Coin, you're not drawing that other card. And Miracle Rogue is already notoriously prone to bad draws. If they draw like double Prep, double Cold Blood, and some other garbage that doesn't affect the board or let them cycle, then they can just lose kind of regardless of what the opponent has. Of course, it also increases your likelihood of really ridiculous plays like turn 1 Edwin Van Cleef that's like 10-10. So basically when it works, your deck is a lot more ridiculous, but you're a lot more prone to get a really bad hand. So I guess the question is, are you willing to take a few more dead draws to make your Gadgetzan Auctioneer and your Edwin Van Cleef a lot more explosive and a lot more powerful? As a non-Miracle Rogue player, my instinct says that this card probably isn't going to be that good, but if it is good, it's probably going to make Miracle Rogue extremely powerful. So basically, if you put a gun to my head right now and said build Miracle Rogue, I would not put this card in my deck, but I will defer to better Miracle Rogue players to make the final decision on the quality of this card. Next up we have Lotus Assassin, so you obviously want to compare this card to Stranglethorn Tiger first and foremost. 5 mana 5/5 stealth, but instead of being a beast, this guy can re-stealth. I actually like this card quite a bit in Tempo Rogue, and I could even see it being played in some variations of Miracle Rogue. The thing about Tempo Rogue, and the thing about just a lot of Hearthstone decks in general, is that they usually play for board control early, but there's kind of a time in the game where you need to flip the switch and just go aggressive, and this card kind of lets you do that. You can trade your 5/5 stealth guy into their Azure Drake or whatever, he gets re-stealthed, or you can just hit them in the face with this card the turn after you play it. It gives you a lot of flexibility between board control and face damage, and in Rogue specifically, Stealth minions are very good Cold Blood targets. If you're playing Cold Blood, sometimes the issue is you don't have a minion that can connect with their face. And this guy, even if he first takes a trade, is a very good Cold Blood activator. So I like this card in Tempo Rogue, and in Miracle Rogue decks that play Cold Blood, I think this card could still see play. Right now, pretty much every Rogue deck plays Azure Drake. I don't know if you necessarily want to give up your Azure Drake for this card, or if you just play it alongside it, or what the deal is, but I think it's definitely a strong consideration. My concern for this card is, if it's good enough, isn't Stranglethorn Tiger already good enough? Like, is the text on this card so good that if Stranglethorn Tiger doesn't see play, this card will see play? I think it kind of remains to be seen, but I like the card. I'll definitely be trying it in a Cold Blood Rogue. Shaku the Collector, the Rogue Legendary. I actually like this card a lot too, and I think it's gotten a lot of unnecessary hate. I've seen a lot of people say it's just a bad Undercity Huckster, but they're kind of just completely different cards. Your opponent doesn't even want to kill Undercity Huckster because that's when you get the card, and Shaku the Collector they must kill, or you'll get more and more cards. Since Shaku has stealth, he's pretty hard to kill before getting a card, so I think you're almost guaranteed to get the card out of this guy, especially if you just play him on turn 3. And because Rogue has cards like Eviscerate or like Backstab, it's pretty easy to keep the opponent's minions off the board so that Shaku can keep getting value. A lot of people look at it and they're like, oh, 3 health on turn 3, that's just going to die every time. But if you look at Shaman, Manatide Totem just draws like 5 cards pretty often. Of course, Rogue and Shaman are different classes. Shaman has probably better tools for protecting their Manatide, but Manatide doesn't even have attack, and sometimes Manatide can just win games on its own. So I think Shaku has similar potential, but probably won't go off as often. But Shaku can also just punch your opponent in the face for 2 damage, and similar to the Lotus Assassin, it's just like a guaranteed Cold Blood activator. Also, Rogue doesn't really have a solid, like very consistent 3-drop. Like Edwin is very situational, SI7 Agent feels bad if you can't combo it, Unearthed Raptor is pretty solid, but if you don't have a Death Rattle you're not getting full value out of it. Shaku the Collector is a card that rogues can just slam on the board on turn 3 and be pretty happy about it. So I actually like Shaku a lot, in Tempo Rogue that is. I don't think this guy really has much place in Miracle Rogue, although maybe Cold Blood variations will play this card. It's a card that's almost guaranteed to replace itself. It comes down at a convenient place on the curve. It's a Cold Blood activator. I actually just like this card a lot, so I'm definitely going to be trying this guy in Tempo Rogue. Finally, we have I Know a Guy, so it's easy to compare this card to Journey Below. When you compare it to Journey Below, I don't think this card looks like super strong. Rogue makes really good use of cheap spells, Warrior doesn't, and Journey Below barely sees any play in Rogue. There are also just a ton of really bad taunt minions, and there really aren't that many bad Death Rattle minions. So I think I Know a Guy, even outside of the synergy, might just be a weaker card than Journey Below. But I Know a Guy does give you something with an immediate effect, whereas if you take Journey Below, generally your opponent can just ignore the minion that you get. They're forced to interact with your taunt. Warrior does have some taunt synergies, but I don't really know how powerful those are. I think I Know a Guy is just like too low value, high variance of a card for Control Warrior. They'd rather just be playing like even a Fierce Monkey over this card, or just like another late game threat or a piece of removal. I think one place this card might see play is in Yogg Warrior, with like Arcane Giants maybe, just like a spell-based warrior. Because if you're playing Yogg Saron, if you're playing Arcane Giant, just 1-mana spells are pretty solid, and especially spells that give you minions are pretty good in a deck like that. So that's the most realistic place I see this card being played. If Bolster Warrior is a thing, maybe you play this card in that deck, but I just don't think that's actually going to be a thing. So it's just a pretty alright card. So that's the end of this set of reviews. Actually, all of the cards now have been revealed, so I really gotta get to it tomorrow, and hopefully those will be up soon.